Good morning, everyone. We're ready to get started now. The agenda for today's presentation starts with some general information and some housekeeping items. Then one of Tensoft's co-founders, Bob Scarborough, will be taking a few minutes to tell you about Tensoft and what we do. After that, I'll introduce today's presenter, Jeffrey Werner, and then turn the floor over to him. After the presentation, Jeffrey will answer as many questions as time permits, and we'll follow up with you via email on any remaining questions if our time runs out today. Next slide, please. First, we do recommend that you view the webcast using the full screen mode. Please submit questions at any time during the presentation using the Q&A panel on your screen. All attendees who requested CPE credit during the registration will receive their certificate within via email, within 1 week after the webcast, provided that you attend the entire presentation and that you answer all of the polling questions. Finally, the presentation slides will be available to download after the presentation. Just click on the handout icon to the left of the feedback icon, located in the upper right-hand corner of your screen, or if you'd like, you can go into the Tensoft Resource Center. In the next couple of days, we'll have it available there for you to download as well. Now we'd just like to take a few minutes to introduce you to Tensoft, the host for today's webcast. For that, I'll turn the meeting over to Bob Scarborough, Tensoft CEO and co-founder. Bob has been in the ERP software industry for almost 25 years and has helped hundreds of software and high-tech companies improve their business processes and lower their operating costs. First, we do want to do a quick check to make sure that everyone is able to hear. If you do have any problems right now hearing, well, I guess you won't be able to let me know, but if you're having problems of any kind, if you would send us a quick question, chat. We'll try to get that resolved for you as soon as possible. So Bob, over to you.
We cannot hear Bob. We're going to fix that in just a second. So thank you for the response on that. Again, if you're just joining us, this is the Tensoft presentation of EITF 08-1, the relative selling price method for multiple element arrangements. We are having some technical difficulties getting Bob's audio up, so we will fix that, and then we'll get the webcast going. Okay, well, we have had some difficulties there. We're going to, you want to do it right here? Sorry about that. Thanks for bearing with us. Looks like we're a one-mic shop today.
Oh, hi, folks. So we'll get going here. And I'll do a very brief who is Tensoft, and so and the main reason we're providing this today, and in the background of who we are, is we're a business software solutions provider focused on technology companies, and we have software for revenue management, specifically software that supports the topic today, the EITF 0801 compliance. So that kind of gives you a reason why it's important for us to help sponsor people like Jeffrey and so on. So our RCM product line is a revenue management suite that does billings and revenue and so on. And you'll put up a list of customers here and kind of give a feel for something of that. But we work with a lot of technology companies and a lot of different sorts of ways to go to market and sell, all resulting in a revenue agreement that requires revenue policy application and revenue recognition. The tricks we found in terms of the revenue compliance itself, there is a process for determining your fair value rates or your fair value, the values for the items. There's a process of applying those to the values, to the sales or revenue transactions that come through, and there is a process for recognizing revenue. But we found that actually different companies, depending on whether you're a product company that ships on a sales order, whether you're a contract-based or enterprise agreement company that does contractual-based, whether you're a SaaS company or some combination of those, there are different ways that the revenue transaction is created or the revenue agreement. And so we have a model that allows us to capture revenue agreements in multiple methods, from your website, from your ERP system, from our contract administration product. And then we do take and apply the determination method to those so that you get the correct revenue agreement based on the independent value and apply the revenue rules automatically, giving you your subledger, your analysis, your revenue waterfalls, and your ability to recognize revenue going forward. And so this is a pictorial way of explaining that, which would be the feeding system on the left-hand side, which is how do we find the revenue agreement? And so if you are a pure SaaS company, you might do all of your sales through your website, and all the transactions may be captured there and formatted. And so the trick for efficiency and for revenue recognition is to move that data from your website or from your CRM system or whatever system you've adapted to manage your customer experience and into the revenue engine. If you're using an enterprise agreement model or our contract administration, then the goal is to take that contract and look at how revenue might be generated from a contract model, either contract-based or transaction-based revenue resulting from that. And if it's really the source is your ERP system or any other types of system, really we have a model that allows you to take and capture the revenue agreement and then push it into the revenue engine where we apply the EITF or the independent valuation, where we apply the revenue rules, where we apply the appropriate document flow for people that have more than one revenue valuation method, and all that generating your subledgers and your reporting. So that's really an overview of what we do. And again, based on today's topic, we do support the EITF 0801 compliance, and it's important for us to associate and learn from people like Jeffrey, where we can really understand more deeply the requirements of the industry and of our existing customers and future customers and make that work for us. So with that said, I have the pleasure of introducing Jeffrey. Tensoft's committed to providing revenue contract management solutions for our customers, but we understand our software is only part of the total solution. Another element of managing revenue recognition in contracts is understanding the rules and standards affecting your business. With that in mind, we're working with thought leaders in this area to provide relevant information and resources to our customers. Pleased to have the opportunity today to sponsor the webinar with Jeffrey Werner. Jeffrey is an acknowledged expert in the area of software revenue recognition. He's been providing software revenue recognition consulting services to technology companies since 2001. Prior to launching his own consulting business, Jeffrey has been a leader in a number of organizations, technology companies, the CFO for Atrium Design Systems, a mixed signal synthesis company. He was a VP of Finance for Telepost, a web-based communication services company. And early in his career, Jeffrey spent 11 years with KPMG in Silicon Valley office, where he was the senior manager. Jeffrey regularly teaches software revenue recognition classes in the Bay Area He has over 15 years experience helping companies comply with revenue recognition regulations through policies and best practices. So Jeffrey, the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Bob. It's a pleasure to be here again with you for another one of our series of webcasts on revenue recognition at Tensoft. And want to mention that as part of my revenue recognition practice, I do present webinars like this and training classes. In addition, there's a number of revenue recognition services that I offer, including deal reviews, best practices implementation, VSOE and ESP studies and analysis, training classes and webinars such as this one, technical research and writing and documentation of policies, and EITF 08-1 implementations are all some of the services that I provide in the revenue recognition area. In addition, we want to let you know that we're going to reprise our software revenue recognition webcast. We did a two-part half-day each webcast in May that was very well attended, and we've had requests to repeat that, so we'll be doing that. Our tentative dates are November 10th, 9 a.m. to 12:30, and again, Thursday, November 17th, we'll do part 2 from 9 a.m. to 12:30. Those are Pacific times. And this is for CPE credit, so there's a full day of CPE credit. It's a pay-per-attendance webcast. You can attend one or both, and registration and details will be provided soon. Included in that seminar will be general principles of revenue recognition, multiple element arrangements, VSOE, and then license support and other services issues for the software industry. Day 2 will include a review of general principles, services, contract accounting, EITF 08-1 and 09-3. A brief set of that will be in the module that we present today. We'll also talk about software as a service in the ongoing FASB IASB revenue recognition project. So again, those are in November, and there'll be more information about that. For today's webcast, you're welcome to submit questions through the question pane, or if you don't get your question answered during the webcast, you're welcome to email me at wernerj@sbcglobal.net, and I will respond to your questions. We'll also try and put up questions and responses that we received by email or that were not answered in today's webcast on the Tensoft blog, and the slides will be available after the presentation. What we'd like to do now is test our polling system, so we're going to launch the first of our polling questions for today. And what do I need to do? That looks okay? But I can't see that, so I guess I can look here. I'm not seeing that. Okay, so our question is, in order to receive CPE credit for today's webcast, you need to be registered and logged in, answer the polling questions, or both of the above. And this is one that you do have to get right in order to get CPE for the webcast today, because you do need to be registered. You do need to answer the polling questions. We're still having answers come in. Okay, so we're going to close the polls. I don't think we'll share that one because I gave away the answer. For today, our agenda includes looking at EITF 08-1, which also goes by the Accounting Standards Updates number 2009-13. It's revenue arrangements with multiple deliverables, and EITF 09-3, certain arrangements that include software. 08-1 gives us a new methodology for allocating and recognizing revenue. 09-3 helps us determine which transactions are included in that new relative selling price method. So we'll be looking at the relative selling price method, the scope and timing of when it needs to be applied, separation and allocation of revenue in multiple element arrangements. We'll have some examples so we can understand how we apply these principles that we talk about. We'll look at contingent revenue, estimated selling price, how to plan and perform an implementation of the new EITF if you haven't done so already, and discuss documentation and disclosure. So with regards to EITF 08-1, it's the new arrangement that covers all multiple element arrangements that are not specifically addressed by another piece of accounting literature. And the major other type of accounting literature that affects companies in the technology segment, and here in the Bay Area in particular, is software revenue recognition, SOP 97-2. With 08-1, we really have two methods of doing our revenue recognition for multiple element arrangements, either software companies or pretty much all other companies. Previously, companies with tangible products were under EITF 0021 and used the residual method similar to software revenue recognition. The new method is called the relative selling price method, and we are going to allocate revenue to the elements in multiple element arrangements based on their relative value, and for valuation we're going to use VSOE, third-party evidence, or estimated selling price. We'll talk more about each one of those in a few minutes. The allocation is based on the relative percentage of each of those items in the transaction, and the residual method is no longer used. EITF 08-1 became effective for companies after June 15th, 2010, and for calendar year companies, that's all companies for calendar year 2011. So if you haven't already adopted this, you will be required to adopt this new methodology for your financial statements that are issued for the year ending December 31st, 2011. Our scope and allocation for separation and allocation, if you're not covered by another piece of accounting literature such as software revenue recognition accounting, then you'd use 08-1 to both do the allocation of the revenue and to do the separation of your elements and the allocation to them. If there's another topic that talks about how to separate them, you would follow that. If there's another topic that doesn't address separation but does address allocation, you use that. And if there are no other topics for your transaction, then you're going to use EITF 08-1 to do both the separation and the allocation of revenue to your multiple elements in your arrangement. So the first step is for us to separate out the transaction into its various elements, and we're going to call a part of an arrangement a separate unit of accounting or a separate element if this delivered item has value to the customer on a standalone basis. And our determination of value on a standalone basis has been broadened from the existing standards used for software. It's going to include if there is resale value, and if it's sold separately by the vendor, or if it's sold by any other vendor. So there's a multitude of ways you can evaluate whether an item has standalone value or standalone basis to the customer. In addition to that, if there's a general right of return on the delivered item, the delivery or performance of any undelivered elements needs to be probable and under the control of the vendor. So if it's just a matter of the vendor sending it and there's nothing that would impede that, then that's not going to impact our ability to separate out a unit. However, if an undelivered element could result in the return of the delivered element, then we're not going to be able to consider that delivered element a separate element for revenue allocation in our multiple element arrangement. Another way of saying that is to use this visual flow chart. And if we've got multiple elements, we ask ourselves, first question is, do the delivered items have value on a standalone basis? And if they do yes, we're going to go down to the next diamond or the next question. If the answer is no, then we won't have a separate unit of accounting for that element. We'll look at it in conjunction with the other elements. If we do have standalone value, then we're going to ask the second question, does the arrangement include a general right of return relative to the delivered item? And is the delivery or performance probable and under control of the vendor? If the answer to that is yes, then we've achieved a separate unit accounting for that item. If it's no, then we're going to consider it in the context, and maybe we'll just have one unit of accounting for the arrangement. To apply values to the items that we've separated out now, we've separated out our transaction into our various elements. We're going to look at the different valuation methodologies that we have and apply one of these to create a value for that element. The first one is vendor-specific objective evidence. And a lot of people are familiar with this because that's been in place in software revenue recognition and EITF 0021 revenue recognition for a number of years now. It's the price that a vendor sells an element for in a separate standalone transaction when those standalone transactions are sold in a consistent manner. And typically that's established by a VSOE study looking back at standalone transactions of a particular product or SKU and analyzing what the price they're sold for separately. And if that price is in a sufficiently narrow band, industry standard has been 80 to 85% of their transactions in a plus or minus 10 or 15% range, then you would have VSOE. Our second valuation methodology, and the one we would move to if we didn't have vendor-specific objective evidence, is third-party evidence, and that's evidence from other companies of what they sell a similar item for. In practice, a lot of companies have found third-party evidence difficult to apply because, one, either there aren't sufficiently similar products offered by other companies, or two, if there are, the vendor doesn't have insight into the pricing of those. So this is an option, but it's one that's not available to most companies most of the time. Our third methodology, if we're unable to establish VSOE or TPE, is the estimated selling price. And that's the vendor's best estimate of what the selling price of an element is in the transaction. We'll talk later in the webcast about the different methods that we use to come up or establish estimated selling price, or ESP. But for right now, what we want to focus on is that we're going to use one of these three values to do the calculation and the allocation of revenue in our multiple element transaction. The transition rules, as we said, this is effective for calendar year companies starting January 1st, 2011. So if you're a calendar year company, you will be using this for your year-end financial statements if you're not already using them for your monthly and quarterly financial statements. There are disclosure requirements. These include disclosing what values you use in your relative selling price allocation and how you arrive at them. So if you're using VSOE, you would say we do a VSOE study and look at our standalone transactions for each one of these elements in the arrangement to come up with the values, and we're applying that. Or if you're using ESP, here's the methods that we used to establish ESP for our elements in our transactions. And there's also the requirement in the first year of adoption of EITF 08-1 for disclosure of the effect of the change, because prior to the adoption of 08-1, a company would have been using either software revenue recognition or EITF 0021, and we want to provide the reader of the financial statements with the ability to understand what is the change in revenue based on the changes in the business, and what's the change in revenue based on the change in our accounting method. And there's a number of ways to do that. There is retrospective or prospective adoption. A company can restate their prior years using the new methodology, or they can just adopt it on a go-forward basis. If you use the prospective method and just adopt on a go-forward basis, you need to disclose the effect of the change in the year you adopt. So if you adopted in 2011, there's two ways to disclose that change. You could say, in 2011, our revenues were $50 million. If we'd used the residual method that we'd used in 2010, they would have been $45 million. Another way to disclose the effect of the change is to say, in 2010, we used the residual method and our revenues were $30 million. If we had used the relative selling price method, our revenues in 2010 would have been $38 million. So the reader of the financial statements is able to understand the effect that the change in the accounting method had on the financial statements, separate from what changed in the business. In addition, the year that you adopt these two new EITFs, you need to do it for an entire year. So if you adopt midstream in a year, you need to adjust retroactively or retrospectively to the beginning of the year. If you haven't issued your 2010 financial statements yet, you can still apply and adopt early and use this in 2010, or you could restate them when you present your 2011. And if you adopt EITF 08-1, you must also adopt EITF 09-3 or ASU 2009-14. So we're going to go to some examples, but before we do that, we'll do our second polling question. And the second polling question is, have your company implemented EITF 08-1? And our answers are, yes, we've completed it. It's in process now. We're thinking about it, or in a doesn't apply to us, or we're not sure. So we've got the polls open now. If you'd like to respond to that, that'd be great. Again, if you'd like to receive CPE credit for today's webcast, you do need to answer the polling questions and be logged in for the entire 1 hour webcast. We are still seeing votes come in. We've got about 200 people on the webcast today. We're glad that you could make it with us, and hope you find the webcast informative. Again, if you've got questions, you can ask them using the questions drop-down box, or at the end of the webcast, you're welcome to email questions to me, and I will respond to them individually and or put them up on the Tensoft blog. So let's take a look at, okay, we're going to close the voting here, and then we're going to share that. And it looks like 44% of the companies or the people attending have completed an implementation of EITF 08-1. 17% have implementation in process, 16% are thinking about it, and 23% said it did not apply. Okay, so we'll continue with some examples to show how the relative selling price method differs from the residual method that we've been using for the past 10 or 15 years with regards to multiple element arrangements. So the three examples we'll look at is under old accounting for the first two. If we had 3 elements and we didn't have VSOE, we'd be using ratable recognition. Our second example, we'll look at 3 elements where we do have VSOE for the undelivered elements and how we apply the residual method. And then on our third example, we'll look at the same situation where we apply the relative selling price method. So in example 1, we're in old accounting, the residual method. We've got a hardware product that includes software, and we're selling that for a package price of $115,000. That includes the hardware, the software, and support and maintenance on both the hardware and the software for 1 year. We do sell support separately, but in this example, VSOE has not been established for the support. So under 0021 or 97.2 type of accounting, we'd be in ratable recognition, and the entire $115,000 transaction would be recognized ratably over the 1 year support period. So we'd be recognizing about $9,600 each month. In example 2, we're going to change that slightly, and we're going to say that in this instance, we do have VSOE for the support, and we sell that for $15,000 a year. So we've got a $115,000 transaction that includes hardware, software, and support. And we do have VSOE for our undelivered element, in this case, the support and maintenance. So at the delivery of the hardware and software, we'd be able to recognize the delivered element, and we defer the full value using VSOE of the support and maintenance. So we would defer $15,000, and we'd recognize that ratably over the 1 year support period at $1,250 per month. The revenue for the delivered items, the hardware and the software, we could recognize on delivery, assuming all of our other revenue recognition requirements are met. So we'd recognize $100,000 at delivery of the software and the hardware. So that's our old revenue recognition methodology using the residual method. Now we're going to look at the relative selling price method. And we've got the same fact set. We've got a $115,000 bundle that includes the hardware, the software, and the support and maintenance for 1 year. We have support sold separately at $15,000 a year, so we have VSOE for that. And so we're going to need to establish the values for our other two elements in the arrangement. In this case, it's the hardware product. And our example, we're going to take as a given or an assumption that the third-party evidence of that hardware product is $75,000. And we've estimated the selling price of the software at $60,000. So we'll use those values to allocate the revenue to each one of those three elements using the relative selling price method. And what we do is we add up the values of each one of those elements, the $75,000 for the hardware based on TPE, the $60,000 for the software based on ESP, and the $15,000 for the support based on VSOE, and that totals to $150,000. So we find out the relative value of each one of those elements, or the percentage of the total value that that element represents. For the hardware, it's $75,000, that's 50%. For the software, at $60,000, that's 40%. And for the support and maintenance, that's at $15,000, that's 10%. Then we're going to take those percentages that we've calculated, and we're going to use them to value the transaction. So the hardware is going to get 50% of the $115,000 value of this transaction. So it's going to get $57,500, and that can be recognized on delivery. The software will receive 40% of the $115,000 and will also be recognized on delivery. And then the support and maintenance will get 10% of the total fee. In this case, it'll be $11,500, and will recognize about $1,000 a month. So you can see that the values for these different elements changed based on the relative selling price method from the residual method. That's because the residual method applied the discount in the deal, in this case that $35,000 difference between the $115,000 transaction price and the $150,000 total value of the transaction, applied all of that $35,000 to the delivered elements and deferred the full value of the undelivered element at $15,000. When we use the relative selling price method, the discount is applied evenly or proportionally to all of the elements in the arrangement. And so our support, which had a $15,000 revenue recognition under the residual method, has $11,500 value of revenue under the relative selling price method. So we get some very different results. And the general trend companies have found, and which of course is why companies advocated the adoption of this method and moving away from the residual method, is that revenue is accelerated for the delivered items when there is a discount present in the transaction. So if we review our examples, in our first example, we didn't have VSOE, and under our old accounting, we had to take ratable recognition for the entire transaction. In example 2, we did have VSOE, so we were able to separate them out and recognize $100,000 for the delivered elements and $15,000 ratably for the support and maintenance, the undelivered element at the outset. And in the third example, when we applied the relative selling price method of EITF 08-1, we had a different result. We recognized $103,500 for the delivered items and $11,500 for the support, the undelivered item, because we spread that discount in the transaction over all the elements instead of just the undelivered elements. So that's a snapshot of some of the changes that this relative selling price method introduces to our revenue recognition, and an example of how we apply the relative selling price method. Of course, this is a simple transaction with just 3 elements and some given information, so we knew what VSOE was, we knew what third-party evidence was, and we knew what ESP was. Of course, in your more complicated transactions, you may have many more elements in the arrangement, and you do need to come up with values for all the elements in your transaction, which may not be the most easy thing. In addition, we need to consider contingent revenue when we allocate the revenue to the elements. So we do allocate revenue to all the elements in the arrangement using the relative selling price method. However, we're going to limit the revenue that we actually recognize to non-contingent revenue, so revenue that's not subject to change. And we have an example of that we'll look at. If we have two products, product A and product B, and we deliver product A and product B is not delivered yet, we have to look at how much of the revenue we can recognize for product A when we deliver it. In this case, our contract price is $200 for each of them, so there's a $400 total transaction fee. And here we've got ESP of $300 for product A and $200 for product B, so our total value in the transaction is $500. The $300 represents 60% of that, and the $200 of product B represents 40%. That causes product A to get an allocation of $240. But if we don't deliver product B and the customer doesn't have to pay for it, we'll have to limit our revenue recognition on product A that we have delivered to $200 because that would be the maximum that we would get. And that $40 difference between the amount we'd allocated to it and the $200 cash we were going to get for it would be that contingent revenue, which is dependent upon the delivery of product B. So anytime there's a contingency in an arrangement or an undelivered element that has an allocation that's less than its contractual price, you may find yourself in the situation where you have contingent revenue and you need to limit the revenue that you recognize on the delivered element. Let's take a pause now and go to our third polling question. We're going to ask the question, what method does your company use to establish ESP? Do you use the cost plus margin method? Do you use a VSOE light or some sort of analysis of standalone sales similar to what we do for VSOE? Do you use an average discount or consistent selling methodology? Or do you make some best estimate based on the limited data that you have? Or is it some combination of the above? Notice we didn't give you a none of the above opportunity because if you're applying the relative selling price method, you have to come up with a value for every item. And if you don't have VSOE for your item, if you don't have TPE, then you're required to come up with an estimated selling price or ESP. And you would need to use one of these four methods, which we'll talk about in more detail as we move forward in the webcast and get to how we actually implement this. So we'll make sure everyone gets a chance to vote here, give you a little over a minute to respond because we do want to both understand how you are coming up with your ESP values, and we want to give everyone an opportunity to get their CPE credit for the webcast today. Okay, we had a couple questions. One was, in the example one, how would the ratable revenue recognition be split up between the hardware and software? It's a good question. I think different companies do it different ways. One way would be to use the relative value of each of those, either the contractual value or some internal management value, to allocate the split between the three elements. The most important thing is that the total revenue that the company recognizes would be limited to that 1/12 amount. If you were recognizing these three different elements in separate line items on your statement of operations or your income statement, then you probably want to split them up using a consistent, reasonable methodology, and one of those might be the contractual values. And our second question was, does this mean that software and PCS are taken outside of 97.2 with hardware? The answer to that question is generally yes, but that's a very good lead into the next segment of our webcast, because now we're going to move on and talk about how we determine whether an item uses the residual method of software revenue recognition or adopts this new relative selling price method. And there's our results of the poll. 41% used a combination, 27% are using a VSOE light approach, 17% some kind of best estimate, and 9% a cost plus margin type approach. So as I indicated, now we're going to talk about EITF 09-3, which is called Certain Arrangements That Include Software. And this is the accompanying EITF that helps us determine when an item is considered a software element and when an item is considered a non-software element or a tangible product. That's one of the best examples of that. So our prior method under EITF 0021 was if a tangible product had hardware and software and the software was more than incidental, then it was considered a software element and followed software revenue recognition of 97.2. Of course, that meant that you would apply the residual method and that you would need VSOE for any undelivered elements. A lot of hardware companies found that this was very cumbersome and didn't really reflect the economics of their transaction when they delivered a high-cost tangible product up front but had to take the revenue ratably over a period of time because they didn't have VSOE for one of the other elements in the arrangement. So our new method of determining whether an item is hardware or software, whether it uses the residual method or whether it follows the relative selling price method, is tangible products that have hardware and software components. If those components work together to deliver the functionality of the product, the reason why the customer is buying it, then they're considered non-software products. And we'll look at some examples of those. If it's considered a non-software element, then we're going to follow the separation and allocation guidance that we just looked at for EITF 08-1, and we would use the relative selling price method rather than the residual method. So again, if a product includes software and other elements like hardware or a tangible product, we're going to look to see whether they work together to provide the functionality, and if they do, we're going to consider them non-software products. We're going to consider that tangible product a tangible product. We won't be following software revenue recognition anymore. We'll talk about some of the companies and products that this affects in a little while. And again, the effective date is the same as EITF 08-1. It was years that began after June 15th, 2010. For calendar year companies, this method starts on January 1st and is combined with EITF 08-1. So here's some of the factors that we're going to use to determine whether software is essential to a tangible product and the software and the hardware work together. One example would be sales without software are infrequent. That would lead you to conclude that the hardware needs the software to deliver the solution to the customer. A vendor can sell products with similar functionality with and without the software. That's not going to affect this product. The vendor can also sell the software on a standalone basis, and that's not going to create a presumption that the software is not essential to the tangible product. The software doesn't have to be embedded in the product. You can deliver the tangible product and download the software to them so you can deliver them at different points in time. And then we say, well, if the non-software elements, the tangible part, has to contribute to the functionality. It can't just be a medium for delivery. So a software company couldn't just load their software on a hard drive or a flash drive, deliver it and say, I'm not a software company, I'm a flash drive company. The hardware or tangible element needs to be integral to the functionality of the product. So EITF 09-3 has 12 examples or cases, they call them, A through L, that just help you decide or see whether elements are in or out of software accounting. And when this was first introduced, or at least was conceptualized, and hardware and other companies were advocating it, I think everyone thought this is going to make things easier. But unfortunately, what we found is that it really has made it much more complicated. So in case A, we've got a computer that's always sold with an operating system. That's going to be considered a non-software element, and it's going to be excluded from software revenue recognition and will follow the relative selling price method. In case B, The computer is sold with an operating system, but it's frequently sold without the operating system, so it has value as a computer without an operating system. In that case, the computer is going to be considered a non-software element, and the operating system is going to be considered a software element. And this is where it gets complicated, because I think people expected that if there was a tangible product and there was software with it, you'd be out of software accounting. And here it's actually gotten more complicated because you've got part of your transaction that's non-software and part that is software. And we'll talk a little bit about how you allocate revenue to those. And then here's an even more complicated case. They call it a PDA, but it's sort of the iPhone example. There's a phone, a camera, music player, and games. In this case, the music player and games are excluded more than infrequently, so sometimes it's just sold with the phone and the camera. So the phone, the camera, the PDA would be non-software, and the music player and games would be considered software elements. So what does that mean? Let's look at an example after we reiterate that if there's undelivered elements in a multiple element arrangement that are both within and without of software and non-software and software elements, you're going to use the relative selling price method to allocate the revenue to everything in the arrangement. Then for each element, you're going to look at, is it a software element or non-software element, and you're going to follow the revenue recognition for those software or non-software elements. Biggest difference there is if it's a software element, you're going to need VSOE for any of your undelivered elements. Let's look at an example similar to case B. Here a vendor sells a computer with an operating system. The total transaction price is $10,000 and includes 1 year of support, and that supports both on the computer and the operating system. The vendor frequently sells the computer without the operating system. So we're going to consider those, the computer non-software and the operating system software. In addition, VSOE doesn't exist for the support, at least on the separate support elements, because we haven't, prior to adoption of 08-1, we really didn't think of things that way and think of selling support on the computer only and support on the operating system only. So we're going to come up with our estimated selling prices for each of the elements in this transaction, and we've got 4 of them. So here we say the ESP for the computer is $7,000. The ESP for the operating system is $3,000. ESP for the support on the computer is $1,250 and $1,250 for the operating system support. So that adds up to a total of $12,500. We calculate the relative percentage of each one. So the computer gets 56%, the operating system 24%, and each one of the supports 10%. And now we'll apply that to the $10,000 fee that we've got. So the computer gets $5,600, 56% of the $10,000. The operating system $2,400, 24% of the $10,000, and so on, $1,000 each for the support. Now we've allocated the revenue, and we need to determine the recognition. Well, for the non-software elements, there's 2 of them. There's the $5,600, which is the computer. We can recognize that on delivery. And the $1,000 for support that we allocated in the transaction, we can recognize ratably over 1 year. So that's how we'll do the non-software. On the software elements, the operating system gets $2,400, and the support gets $1,000. But since we don't have VSOE for the support on the operating system, and we are in residual method software revenue recognition, we'd have to take the software and the support ratably over the 1 year period because we don't have VSOE. So what companies are affected? Well, really any company except a pure software company will be affected by this. So computer hardware companies, medical device companies, consumer electronics, communications, biotech, any company that has a multiple element arrangement that's not addressed by other specific literature, and that's primarily software for technology companies. Now, there are other types of industries and companies that have their own unique revenue recognition. For example, some entertainment, oil and gas, leasing, and finance companies might find themselves under different accounting. But for the most part, we're going to be thinking for revenue recognition purposes that our companies are either under software revenue recognition or under non-software revenue recognition. And anytime you have a multiple element arrangement, for example, in biotech, or maybe you license some technology, but also you do some services of some kind, you've got a multiple element arrangement that doesn't have software in it, you're going to use this relative selling price method to allocate the values to each one of the elements in your arrangement so that you can recognize them as you deliver each one of those elements. Some of the implementation issues that we encounter: how are you going to do this relative selling price calculation? Are you going to do it manually for each transaction because you've only got a few, or are you going to do some kind of automatic application through either your ESP system or some sort of revenue recognition tool? What methods are you going to use to establish TPE and ESP for your transaction elements? And then you've got to document that methodology and disclose your methodology for your TPE and ESP, as you do now for VSOE. How are you going to tie your products and SKUs to the non-software or software revenue recognition methods? Some products may have two methods that they use depending on other elements in the transaction. So in our examples earlier, when we sold the software with the hardware and we always sold it there, that software would be recognized, that SKU would be recognized using non-software revenue recognition and not the residual method. If that same operating system was sold separately, it would have software revenue recognition, and if there was support with it, that support would need VSOE. So you may find that your elements in your pricing matrix and the tie of the revenue recognition to each one of those elements may expand, because you may need to have separate SKUs for that operating system when you sell it with a product, and a different SKU when you sell it separately. So you may need to look at and evaluate that. Another big issue is we're not sure how this is going to pan out. When VSOE first came out 15 or 20 years ago, there was a real different standard of what was VSOE and what was acceptable. Well, that's changed and evolved over the years. And the relative selling price method and what's valid method of establishing ESP is probably going to evolve over the next couple of years as well, both as auditors interpret ESP when they audit companies and when the SEC reviews public companies and provides comment letters. Want to remember that SAB 104 is still in effect, so you still need to meet the 4 principles of revenue recognition. You need to have evidence of an arrangement. You need to have fixed and determinable fee. You need to deliver or perform the service, and you need to have a collectible fee. And these changes are required. They're not optional. So if you're a multiple element arrangement that's not software, you're going to be using the relative selling price method. The residual method is no longer available, and you can't use the residual method to determine ESP. If you've got 4 elements in a transaction and you've got a VSOE or ESP for 3 of them, you can't back in to that 4th element. You do need to come up independently with the value for it. So how do you establish ESP for an element? As we mentioned earlier in our question, there are at least 4 methods that companies are using. The cost plus gross margin method. So if you've got a tangible product where you've got labor and materials costs, you can total those costs up, determine what sort of margin you think is appropriate, add that on top, and that would potentially be your ESP. Another method is this VSOE light approach, where you take examples of prior sales on a standalone basis, look at what those values are, and maybe you've got a broader range of available options than under VSOE, so maybe 60% of the transactions are within plus or minus 20%. Maybe that's good enough for ESP. I think this is one of the areas that's really evolving. If you have consistent pricing and you have average discounts off of list price by product family or business segment, maybe you can use that. And other than that, you're going to have to do your best estimate based on whatever available information you have. So if you've got a new product you haven't sold previously, or you're a startup and you're just starting to sell products, you're going to have to come up with an estimate based on some as best evidence that you can. It may not be as objective as VSOE or one of these other methods, but you're going to have to come up with some reasonable and consistent way to establish ESP for your elements in your transactions. And that may evolve over time, but you need to do your best estimate from the outset. And again, remember, if you've got refundable services or contingent revenue, you're going to have to limit the revenue that you recognize. You want to establish ESP and ranges. That way, if you've got a contractual price that's in the range, you could use the contractual price. And remember that these are estimates. You wouldn't expect estimates to be down to the penny, for example. So a range of plus or minus 10% is probably a good idea. You want to segment your population by product families, distribution channels, industry, customer size. All of those things would influence how you come up with your ESP. And you probably want to look at how you assign SKUs in your arrangements, whether you want to have separate SKUs for each method that an item might be sold, or if you want to have some sort of formula that determines, oh, that's an operating system sold with the hardware, and that makes it under non-software accounting, or it's software that's really sold separately and is going to be recognized using software accounting in the residual method. Let's go to our fourth polling question. And our fourth polling question is, when your company implemented EITF 08-1, did revenue increase, decrease, stay the same, or does this not apply because you're not using or did not or have not yet implemented 08-1? And we've got a couple questions while we're looking at that. It says, is ASU 2009-14 only for tangible items with software? Well, no, it's for any multiple element arrangement that has more than one element in it that's not covered by software accounting or some other arrangements. So, for example, as I mentioned, biotech companies aren't selling software, but maybe they license the technology to the customer and do some sort of services or research project. That would make that a multiple element arrangement. So they would be covered by this new relative selling price method. If we have two different ways to sell our product, customer buys a perpetual license and has it on site, or SaaS, the premise deals would be under 97.2 and the SaaS deals would be under 08-1. That would be correct if they were sold separately. But if you sold a perpetual license in the same transaction with a SaaS, you would need to allocate the revenue to those two elements, to this perpetual license and to the SaaS arrangement and any other elements in the arrangement using 08-1, the relative selling price method. Then you'd apply software revenue recognition to the perpetual license and non-software revenue recognition to the SaaS arrangement. So that's one example of a software company that would be impacted by this, because if you're licensing your software or marketing it to your customers in those two different ways, one under SaaS and one under perpetual licenses, if you did that in a combination sale or in a sale that was within close proximity and was determined to be a linked transaction, you would need ESP for your software license, for your perpetual license, and would allocate the revenue to it based on the relative selling price method. Then you'd apply your software revenue recognition. And how does this apply to web-based application services? Well, if you've got a web-based service, which would sort of be a service rather than a perpetual licensing, if you're selling more than one thing, you're going to need to separate and allocate using this methodology of 08-1 that we previously discussed. So if you have a web-based service and you do consulting or training on top of that, you may have multiple elements that you'd need to consider how you allocate and recognize the revenue. So if you are going to implement this new EITF, and we're going to kind of move quickly through the remaining slides because we're coming up on the end of the hour, there's a lot of work that you need to do. It's not a trivial exercise. You need to gather a lot of information, analyze it, come up with your VSOE and ESP methodologies and how you're going to document them. Then you need to allocate that to each of the elements using ERP system or some sort of revenue tool. You're going to have to test that. You're going to have to write a memo that says what you did and perform an ongoing analysis and document your methodologies as you go forward and as your VSOE and as your ESP changes with time. In that memo, here's a number of things that you'd want to cover: your company background, when you're adopting, what transactions are affected, how you determine which are software and which are non-software elements, what kind of distribution models you have, how you do the separation and the allocation. Again, how you came up with your VSOE and your ESP and your TPE, how you applied them, how you're going to disclose on it, any other issues that came up in your implementation and that might affect the readers of the financial statements that include this new methodology. Now, real quickly, some of our companies in the Valley have adopted EITF 08-1 that are public companies. Apple did this, and they did the retrospective approach where they went back and restated the 2 prior years, so they presented 3 years of income statements under the new method. Cisco, another early adopter, chose the prospective approach. They disclosed what the impact was before and after the change. When Apple adopted, revenue increased 15% just because of this change in accounting. And an interesting disclosure that Apple made was they said that we think the ESP for iPhone upgrades and support is $25. That's based on what we would expect customers to pay, not necessarily on an in-depth VSOE type of analysis. In addition, they made this disclosure, if we are wrong by $5, if it should have been $30 or if it should have been $20, that would have resulted in a $50 million change in revenue during the period. Cisco, which used the prospective adoption, their revenue increased just 1% from the adoption of EITF 08-1 in the first quarter that they did it. And their ESP disclosure includes statements that they consider geographies, market conditions, competitive landscape, all these other subjective elements when they establish their VSOE. So it is a subjective process that includes a lot of different factors, not just a hard calculation of numbers. So in conclusion, there's a lot of revenue recognition resources for you out there. If you look at the Big Four and some of the other accounting firms have revenue recognition guidelines and revenue recognition white papers or study guides for you. You can look at the AICPA and the FASB. SEC filings of companies where they disclose their methodologies for ESP are really useful for crafting your disclosures and maybe understanding what similar companies are doing. Webcasts such as this, and you can just do some web searches which will give you some really interesting information. Again, if you've got a question, we'll have time maybe to answer a few more questions today. You can do that on the GoToMeeting menu. If you have a question that we didn't get to today, or you think of one later in the day or tomorrow, you're welcome to send me an email and I'll try to answer your question for you or post it on our blog. And my email address is there. It's wernerj@sbcglobal.net. I am a revenue recognition consultant, work with a lot of companies over the last 9 years for a variety of revenue recognition issues. And again, want to make you aware of our upcoming webcast. Will be in November, a 2-part, all-day software revenue recognition webcast broken up onto 2 days. And we do say Pacific Daylight Time, but I think that we might be into Standard Time by that time, so we'll need to change that. There will be CPE credit for that, and there will be pay per attendance. There'll be registration and details soon. You're on the mailing list because of attending this webcast today. And our content of that course is going through multiple element arrangements for software companies, VSOE, license support, and other services issues. We'll look at services accounting. We'll cover EITF 08-1 and 09-3 in a little more depth than we did today, software as a service, and the FASB ISB revenue recognition project. So again, thank you very much for joining us today on the webcast. If you've got a revenue recognition need, please give me a call or email. We can discuss your issues. There's a variety of services that I offer for technology companies in the revenue recognition area. And we want to thank you for joining us today. So that concludes our webcast. I'm going to see if there's any questions that we need to answer that we can quickly answer, and there's quite a few. So I think I'll post those on the blog. Give me a couple days to do that. I may send you an email or direct you to the blog, And we did have quite a number of people today on the webcast. I've got to get those certificates created and emailed out to you. So please, wait a week or so before you start asking where it is, because it will take some time to do that. So again, thanks very much for joining us. We will have the 2 half-day webcast in November, and there'll be another Tensoft revenue recognition webcast in the future too. Thank you very much for joining us today.